Well, hey everyone. Hey Ryan.
Hey Steve, great to be with you on another Free for All Friday.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think this is like volume 8 for us or something like that now.
I don't count. I don't count. I don't want to. I don't want to know. We're here. I,
Is-
I'm excited about today. You know, we've
yeah,
interviewed some pastors over the last couple of weeks, and that's been cool just to see the work of the gospel in North Jersey, as well as how the church is advancing the gospel around the nation. Today, we get to see a little bit how to advance the gospel or how to live out our faith in the corporate sector, specifically as a leader. And so, pretty excited about that.
yeah, really awesome. So we're bringing on Scott Hopeck. Ryan mentioned a couple of weeks ago that there's, just the wisdom in looking at multiple coaches. And, it's really neat to see just how Scott has been a blessing to our church over the course of a long period of time. Many of you probably never heard his name or seen him, except he has been very much a blessing for our church and for us, as he's done a lot of, coaching just in an ad hoc way with Ryan and myself and others. And so excited to bring him on. So let's go ahead and bring him on. And you guys get to meet Scott Hopeck. Here he is. What's up, Scott?
Hello, gentlemen.
Excited to have you, man. When we talk about like the spiritual gifts of leadership, it's a clear gift you have, and I think it's God-given. And I know Steve and I personally have learned a lot from you over the years, but you lead in a far more broad construct than that, right, Steve? And so,
yeah. We're excited to hear. I'm actually just personally excited, even though I've heard from you many times. I'm excited just in this context, especially what we're walking through right now, to just hear how you're processing and what you see in leadership. But you've got the full. I can tell you've been doing meetings via video all the time because you've got the full gear. You're ready to go.
Well, I'll tell you this much. My because of the schooling from home, my kids have kicked me out of the office. My wife has kicked me out of our bedroom. So I have a drafting table set up in this small room that's kind of a guest room with closets behind me, and I have this headset on just so that I can block out all the ambient noise, so that you can't hear dogs and kids and doorbells and everything. So hopefully we have good audio in this secluded closet.
The chances of this being interrupted by one of our families at some point are pretty high, but we're just going to plow on forward.
I think by the end we'll all look like professional Fortnite players on our.
That's right.
Well, Scott, would love to give people just a little context of where you lead, what your role there is, and so why don't we start there? Just help people to understand kind of where you're coming out of.
And maybe over the last 10 years too, Scott, how it's continued to reposition.
Yeah, sure. So, and definitely as I get started here, interrupt me with questions on it. But so my role is a division president, which just is a fancy way in our company saying that you oversee a number of cities. And I happen to oversee our operations for iHeartMedia, which is the name of the company, for 12 of the top metros in the country. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in, if you want to call it a position. I'm also part of what's our company terms as an operating committee. So I work with our C-suite, and we're responsible for, really setting the strategy for the company and dealing with the issues, right? Whether they be political issues or product issues or competitive issues.
Yeah, that's helpful. I don't think most people start there. So how's your journey gotten there over the last 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, I'll give you one piece of context that'll tee up the last 5 to 10 years. So I'm the son of a plumbing and heating contractor. So I learned how to, my dad taught me to fix blocked toilets and unclog sewers and clean furnaces and do that type of thing. So he taught me two things, and one was just by the nature of the work, which was work ethic, like how to work hard. And the other thing that I remember him instilling in my mind was leave things better than you found them. And that little nugget, I think, is what inspired me, even though I didn't know it early on in my career. I came up the sales side of the business, and my focus had always been whoever I'd been working with as a partner, how do they end up better out of our relationship than we started? And that then carried over as I went through business school and came out and continued in the industry. I pretty much got in where things were broken. So I was in Philadelphia, and my journey went from Philadelphia to Atlanta to Phoenix to Jersey, then to these divisional roles where you just have more oversight in the company. And each one of those roles, to answer your question, over the last 20 years has been taking over an underperforming property or an underperforming business and figuring out how to get it on the right track again. So my role pretty much has been kind of a turnaround guy, moving across the company and the country.
Yeah, and obviously leading through change and hard change is a lot of what you've done through
Yes.
that. And this could be a masterclass, in terms of what it looks like to lead through change. And there's a lot that we're all kind of under pressure in right now, just considering the cloud of what we're in and the culture. But for you, what do you think were some of the biggest things that you've seen, trends, things that you go, man, if you're leading through change, or you're trying to lead in a high pressure situation, and we'll just jump right into application of leadership. What have you seen as kind of those big pillars that you go, these are so important?
Yeah, so for me, the first thing, and this is a trend for me, every city and every operation that I've been in, and I learned it early on, thankfully, is it starts with culture. And I say that for this reason. You might be thinking, wow, it's got to be the product, it's got to be the strategy. I think it starts with the culture, and I'll explain it this way. And this is the analogy. It's probably the only thing that I've ever coined in my life, and it's because I had thought about it for so long. But I saw, or I see culture like the operating system of a computer. Right. So if you remember, and those of you that are listening, if you remember Windows ME when it came out in 2000, it died really quickly. 6 months, it was off the market. It was buggy. It was slow. It crashed all the time. And so to me, culture is the same way in a business, right? If you had Windows ME and you had a bad operating system, it didn't matter how good PowerPoint was or Excel or Word, it was going to crash. And it's the same thing in business. If you have a bad culture, it doesn't matter how good your strategies are, they're going to crash. And so for me, one of the very first things that I do if I walk into a situation that's underperforming is I'll ask my HR business partner, I'll say, listen, give me a 3-year history of the voluntary terminations, the people that have left our company on their own. Because if I start to see a trend line there, I liken it back to, and I use sports analogies often. I grew up playing sports, and I'll go back to Michael Jordan since it's obviously quite popular on ESPN right now. Michael Jordan doesn't want to play with scrubs, right? And it's the same thing with star performers in a company. They don't want to be in a bad culture. They want to be somewhere where they're challenged and they're held accountable and they're pushing for that next championship. And if your culture allows mediocrity, right, then those stars don't want to be there. And so if I start to see that trend line of stars leaving an organization without even walking in the building, it's my telltale sign that I probably have cultural issues that I'm walking into. Is that
Yeah, no, that's that's gold. I'm curious, I'm obviously looking at, metrics to say, okay, how many people have left is one thing, but when you walk into an environment, what are some of the other things that you walk in and you go, okay, these are some telltale signs that something culturally is amiss here?
Yeah, so one of the interesting ones, so if I pull a bunch of leaders together in a room, okay, and say I have 5 managers in a room, maybe it's the department heads or something like that. If I ask a question in the room and everybody kind of defers to who the leader is in the room, and they don't feel comfortable answering, number one, or answering honestly, which is really hard to tell in the beginning. But if everything seems in deference to that leader, it tells me what kind of operation is probably run there. Because I've walked into operations where the leaders in that organization welcome dissent. and they welcome candor, and they want that kind of discussion. So people have a natural kind of, the muscle's been exercised to have open communication and be honest and upfront. And in environments where that's not the case, and the leaders are more command and control, and they don't really empower their folks, you can kind of get that sense first off in a meeting.
Scott, we have a ton of young people in our church, and they're in their early 20s, first job, and they're brought into a room like that in a corporation, and their temptation is to kind of lay low in the beginning, to not speak up. How would you coach those guys in our church who sit around you at the Glen Rock campus, so are new in their job and they're nervous? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, know your shot, right? So if you're in that situation, you're probably laying back, maybe because you're self-conscious about what you might say that might put you in a bad light. And I'm fully aware of that. Like you said, what signs? Like a sign might tell you something when people don't speak up in a room. If I see that over and over again, and I see a trend line of that in the organization, it's probably leadership. But if it's a meeting and I recognize that some of the folks are on the younger side, some of them are on the more senior side, I'm probably not expecting the younger ones to speak up as much. But advice in there is like, kind of know your position, know your what you're confident in, what you can speak about. And I look back at that question, and I go back to the fear, and I think if that person's not comfortable talking because of an issue they have with themselves, it's one thing. But if they're fearing their boss and what retribution might happen if they say the wrong thing, then you got to kind of question that environment, right? Maybe look for another mentor in the building, or something if you feel like it's a right fit culturally. Which points me back to another question, another comment that I think would be useful for the group that you just spoke about, is a lot of times during an interview, people will ask the question about culture, which I absolutely love, right? So what kind of culture is it that I'm getting into? And I really think that when you're in your 20s or you're with that company, you need to press hard. You don't ask that as a surface question because you think people want to hear it. You really need to peel back and interview that company and make sure that the values within that company match up with your values, and that the person you're interviewing with can actually give you examples of it. Because it's easy for me to say, hey, we value innovation and we value collaboration, and we have and give you, and we have got these open spaces, and and make you feel good about the words that I'm saying. But what's behind those words? Do those things really exist there? Give me examples. Let me talk to some of the people on your staff if I'm going to move in, because that fit is so critical between you and that organization as to whether, the die is almost cast in that situation as to whether you're going to speak in that meeting based on the culture that you walked into. If that makes any kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering, and I know over the years, as you shared some things with us, some of the things we've been challenged in to go, okay, we want the best culture you can have, and we want that kind of openness and honesty and collaboration and getting the best out of these gifts of people that you have at your table. And candor is big in that. But as you talk to leaders who maybe are going, man, I want the best culture I can have as a leader, where do you start to develop that? What are some things you've seen that are helpful? Because you've come in and you've had to kind of revamp certain divisions and areas, regions. Where do you start to address that? Obviously at a leadership level, but what are some of the things you can do?
Yeah, I think one of the very first things is having a clear sense of purpose, right? What is the purpose of the organization, right? It's fulfilling a larger mission out there, and people have to align with purpose. I read something once, and this was a while ago, so forgive me if I certainly don't remember who the author was, but people go to work for purpose, play, or pleasure. A lot of what we go to work for is those things, right? And purpose is, man, I absolutely, in our case, I absolutely love broadcasting because I feel like I have to get important information to the consumer. And I'm that journalist that allows that to happen, and they feel a sense of purpose, and that's what gets them moving. Potential is like, I'm coming because I want to work here because of how this job can help grow me. And they have these opportunities to expand me and move me overseas and run different businesses and opportunities. And the potential from this business motivates me and drives me. And then play could be one of the other things, right? So play is like people that are in the creative side or the curious side or the innovative side. If that's what they're into, they get their sense of purpose from play. So, I break those three things down, but I want to come back to the top and say that sense of purpose, I think, is where culture starts from. And when you have the purpose of the organization, what are the values, those core values that undergird that purpose, right? And then it's how you live them, because it's not about just putting a plaque on the wall. Because that doesn't mean any. I mean, you could say we have like a mission statement, we've got our purpose, and we got these values, but it's how you live them, and what the written things and the unwritten things, the spoken and the unspoken things that happen within your organization that either support those core values or not. And if you're in a mediocre culture, it's a culture that doesn't have accountability to those core values. So you may say, oh yeah, we love innovation or we love transparency. However, all your meetings are closed door and no one shares what's going on behind the curtain. And it's like, okay, we say we love transparency, but what are we actually doing with our people? And when you have that, I'll call it zero connection, there's no connective tissue between the two, that's where your high performers who came for a certain cultural value, they're like, this doesn't work for me. I came from a transparent culture before. I loved it. I thrived in it. You told me we have it. Now we don't. And now I'm out the door.
Scott, I love what you said about the purpose piece. And, you're not just a great leader in kind of the place you serve, but you're also a Christian, and you have a very real faith. How does that kind of, Steve and I know you well. We see your love for the Lord, and how does the purpose of your faith help guide as you lead in your job each day?
Yeah, listen. Every morning I pray, and part of my prayer is that the Spirit would produce in me the fruits of the Spirit, right? I want in my daily life love, joy, peace, patience. Like it starts with love for me, and I go back to what was instilled in my, whether it was biblical or not, leaving things better than you found it. You don't pour into people and spend time with people and listen to people without having that love for people, right? And I would actually consider myself more of an introvert than an extrovert, but I feel I'm called to love. And it's a tough, when you're working for a public company, no less, it's a tough line to walk, because some people might want to take advantage of you sharing your faith too openly at work. And you have to look for the right opportunities. And for me, I do look for those opportunities. I'll often have employees that are struggling, or employees that got to know me in one way or another, ask me to coffee or ask me to a dinner or something like that. And in that discussion, if I get their permission to talk about faith, and usually the way the conversation goes like this is, are you sure you really want to know what's, because typically somebody will point out to me and say, how could you be this way? Or how in the face of this person doing that did you react that way? And by no means I'm saying that I'm the perfect example of anything, but in certain stages, I feel, blessed to have the courage to, or have had the courage to do maybe the right thing. And when people ask me, how did you do that? That's where I get permission. I'm like, hey, listen, do you really want to know? Because we're on, and if you want to know, I'm going to tell you how to get there. And I'll tell you the relationships I've developed from that have been tremendous.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And that shows, and that goes back to part of that culture is you as a leader setting the tone. And obviously the best tone we can set is one that's like Christ. And, setting that tone, being willing to hear, being willing to, to actually care about the people who are sharing what they want you to hear. And I guess that's one question I have too, when you talk about applying these things to leadership. Um, like right now, in the middle of what we're all walking through, and there's all kinds of, changes and uncertainty. Um, how should good leaders respond in the middle of this, or even when someone comes to you and they say, hey, show me what's going on in my division, and there's some broken things, and you share those things with them? How do you see good leaders respond? What does good leadership look like in responding to those things that are hard to navigate or that are hard to hear?
Yeah, so I've said the best leaders don't get defensive about it, right? So I tell people all the time, when I start with a new leader or I start with a new division, there are a handful of things that can kind of get you on the radar with me. The first thing is not recognizing you have a problem, right? So if you have a problem, if something's broken in your division and you're in denial, because that's usually what happens, they're like, oh, look over here, this is okay over here, and they're in denial, or they refuse to see the fact that it's broken. That's the first kind of issue, right? And if you get by that and you recognize you have a problem, but the second thing would be suffering in silence, not raising your hand. So you may know you have a problem in your organization. You might not be fully resourced to fix it or have the answer, but if you suffer in silence and don't raise your hand and say you have a problem, that's the second thing that'll get you on my radar. And the last thing I would throw out there would be if you lose the confidence of your team. And that's a really hard one to recover from, because if you're in a leadership role, you need that team to run through walls with you. And if you've lost the confidence of your team, you're likely in a spot where you'll need to be repurposed, and we have to really look at functionally what your strengths are. Or maybe it was early in your leadership career and you made a couple missteps. Maybe change of venue or something like that will help you grow. Because we make mistakes. I make mistakes every day. We make mistakes all the time. It's how we recover from those mistakes that keep us moving forward.
Yeah, no, that's really good, and that's hard, because a lot of the things that got you to where you were producing, that you're taught when you join a company or an organization, that work ethic and that drivenness, some of those things, when you get to the level of leadership, it takes a whole different set of understanding to work with others and to help lead others, and that's a hard transition. And I'm sure you see that a lot, just people who were great workers who, maybe they developed defensiveness because they had to defend their project really well, and they could do it well
Sure.
in a certain context. But then as a leader, you've got to be able to hear, and you've got to be able to want to hear, because you want together for everyone to benefit.
Yes, Steve and I sometimes talk about when you're in startup mode, no one believes you. And so you almost have to learn not to listen to anyone to start it up, birth the thing. But then suddenly it works. And now the whole skill set that got you here is opposite the skill set you need at this next spot.
And it makes me think,
how many startups do you see?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, how many startups do you see? Just look at the tech space over the last 10 years, where a great idea starts, and then the venture capitalist firm or whoever owns the majority stake comes in and has to put different leadership in, because what got them there is not what's going to get them to the next phase. You're right on with that comment.
And it just makes me think that maybe there's just something broken foundationally in those earlier stages, that had someone come alongside a younger person in that work, or in our context, in ministry, or, and said, hey, I know it feels like this, but this is really what's going to help you be the kind of leader that you need to be, that there wouldn't have to be such a deconstruction in order to construct later on. And I think there's a certain mindset that goes, I have to be this way, but I just think it's broken. I don't think you have to be that way. It's just so much has to be unlearned from what we're kind of inherently taught, or we think.
The other thing that goes to that I am a firm believer is understanding someone's talents versus their skills, right? So talents are those innate things that we learned when we were small or we were born. I say God-given, but in some situations I can't say that. But they're the God-given talents that you have. And skills and knowledge and experience, all of that stuff can be bought, right? Skills, knowledge, and experience can be bought over time, and it can be trained. But you can't train the talents, right? So maybe a lot of founders have certain talents that either weren't coached properly, because you can get more out of coaching somebody against their strengths than you ever will coaching them against their weaknesses. And I always use the analogy of a fish, right? If you tried to teach a fish to fly, all the energy that you put behind that, you might get it to jump out of the water a little bit, but it's never going to soar with the eagles, right? But if you took that fish and said, you know what, I'm going to get you to fly faster and deeper, and you'll have the best fish in the world, because you're taking the talents it naturally has and making it do more. And so if those leaders that had to turn over later in their career weren't coached properly, to your point, against their talents, or if their talent wiring just isn't to be that kind of leader, because some leaders are designed to be creative, messy, chaotic. They don't do well with we'll call it authority or process or system. But that's actually what enables the birth of the business. We'll go start another business because hand it or work with another. So you I think you kind of got to look at talents and not get confused with trying to train someone's talents. You could train their skills, like dribbling a basketball, but you can't train their talents. And what I see, though, I see, like, I think of the transition just in my business alone, is probably in a lot of other businesses, the thing that gets in the way is ego. When you move one position up and you move to the next position up, not raising your hand when there's a problem, it's usually because your ego's getting in the way. You don't want that thing to be bruised. You don't, but if you're finding your satisfaction in life from earthly things, right? Things that the ego boosts, you're not going to be able to put that ego aside to be, I think, in my opinion, a strong leader, because you got to be able to put your ego aside, realize that we're dealing with problems, and everybody has problems, and it's not a reflection of the problem. Maybe isn't a reflection of you, but the solution can be, if you focus on the solution. But I find that people putting their egos aside is the hardest thing to do. And it gets back to exactly what you started with, is how do they receive that information? Mm-hmm. When you're dealing with a high ego person, that conversation looks a lot different.
Yeah, and I think one of the hardest weird paradox things is that, at least I've found in terms of from a ministry context, just the more leadership that you step into, you think the more, I think that the paradox is you tend to think, just from what you watch or what you read sometimes, you tend to think that means you have to put on another weight of responsibility in terms of taking it yourself, but it's actually this empowering and entrusting and emptying yourself and coming alongside the gifts, the talents of others. And it's almost this paradox that has to be, taught and then untrained from all this other stuff, that we assume about leadership. I think a lot of times, I know I did growing up and being, learning what I could learn about leadership from watching people. It's more of an emptying and an empowering. And that's a hard thing, for people that are, in one sense, used to going, no, put it on me, and it is putting it on you, but just in a different way. You're putting something else on.
In a different way.
Yeah.
To the Michael Jordan illustration before, Scott, it's been fun to watch The Last Dance, but growing up, hearing the stories of Michael Jordan, it was always, he didn't make the basketball team. He was up shooting foul shots. He's in the weight room before games. Kind of all the stuff he's doing, and yet what's amazing to watch the shows is, yes, his work ethic is insane, his competitiveness is insane, maybe even mentally ill, but what no one talked about was how much of his energy and effort went into pushing teammates, and granted, his style of the way he pushed, I'm not sure would work in the church world. Right. So some pastors have tried it, but that piece of him emptying himself and pushing others forward wasn't taught as much as as it was part of him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Individual exceptionalism just looks very different, than I think some people assume it does. And leadership exceptionalism looks very different than I think a lot of times we think. You mentioned before, Scott, about some things that get people on your radar, not in a good way,
Yeah.
when you're walking into these situations. And one of them you mentioned was, are you willing to, do you just sit as a silent sufferer, or are you willing to raise your hand? And, one of the interesting questions I think comes out of that is, it's one thing, yes, leadership is an important part of that. And if the leader won't allow for it, then that's a broken system and a broken culture. And it's a miracle to change that
Right.
without changing the leader. But for those that are not the leaders in the room that actually set and define the culture, you still contribute to the culture. And I guess the question that comes out of that for me is, what are things, for those that aren't leaders in the room, what are things they can do to actually not only help the organization accomplish the goals that will benefit everyone, but even to help the leaders, continue to grow and be better at leaders, because we can all grow.
Because, my fear, Scott, is people are listening to this going, oh, that's my boss. That's what's wrong. And yet they're going to go to work. Maybe we'll go to work.
Yeah.
They're going to go to work and not realize they're part of that system as well.
Yeah, no, that's right on. So what I would offer, like if somebody came into me and was looking for coaching on that immediately, whether you're a leader, or I'll even just take it as one of the employees who doesn't see themselves as a leader, I'd first ask them to reframe what leadership means. And I would argue that I could probably find something that they are leading, right? They might be a parent leading children. They might be an older sibling that is by default leading, whether they asked for it or not. But at the worst case, if they're breathing, they're leading their own life. And in some way, shape, or form, you are thrust into leadership, whether you are the person that's standing in front of the room or behind the room or in the middle of the room. And reframing what leadership is sometimes necessary, because everybody carries their own filter of what a leader is. And there is so much written, and I've read so much, but there's so much written and read about this. And I boil it down, I think of front, middle, and back, right? So there are leaders that lead from the front, right? There are leaders that lead from the middle, and there are leaders that lead from the back, right? And when you think of leading from the front, I often think, this is just me personally, in a crisis situation. And that's oftentimes where people will, who are employees will say, well, the leader up in the front. And that's typically because they don't know what to do. It's an unfamiliar situation. It's not in the handbook. It's not in the mission statement. It's like they don't know. So they need a leader at that moment to stand up in that command and control position and give prescriptive guidance. But what they may miss is that leading from the middle is where that leader that you saw up in the front is actually walking alongside with you. And you actually, in that situation, you're leading each other. There's a thing called reverse mentorship that happens. But if you're an astute employee, as we're talking on that side, you recognize that, and you have a good leader in the building, there are opportunities to walk together. And if you're in a really good culture, you have leaders leading from behind. And you think of a shepherd. A shepherd leads from behind, right? That shepherd's relying on the most nimble sheep to be out front and the rest of them to kind of follow. And maybe that shepherd's just making sure from behind that the weak ones don't get, eaten by a coyote or something, right? So it's a different role to lead from behind, but at that point, that actually gives you the opportunity as the employee to stand up and be one of those nimble people in the front, or see another employee that is struggling with innovation or connecting the dots on something in the organization. And if you have the right leadership in your organization and you have somebody leading from behind, which I think successful organizations have leaders that recognize they can lead in any stage of those, and you have to know when to step into one of those. But when you're in success mode, you're leading from behind and letting your strongest people out front show that and prove that to themselves, prove that to the organization. So I think a little reframing and a little understanding that leadership actually is not always just being out front could be helpful.
Scott, I know you've not specialized, but you've definitely taken part in a number of turnarounds.
Yes.
I was chuckling to myself a little bit before when you said, if someone's defensive, they don't have a problem. And I'm like, the fact that you're in the room means there was a problem. Uh, but, I was thinking sometimes, unfortunately, the problem is that leader. And you'll have to make a decision to either kind of put them in the right spot, or maybe, unfortunately, even see them transition. And I know leaders come in all kinds of shapes
Sure.
and sizes and molds. But if you're looking for someone to refill a leadership position, is there a quick grid you go, these 3 or 4 traits are my musts? Now I know there's all kinds, but is there 3 or 4 things you really look for in leaders when you're trying to put someone in the leadership position?
So values is obviously a key thing. I want somebody with integrity, responsibility. They do the right things for the right reasons. Like you need to have trust, because you can't do the job for them. And particularly when you're when you're talking about time zones, you're separated by space and time in getting things done. You need to be able to trust that person. So I think trust is one of the key ones. Their drives and their work ethic are things that I look to. Drives being like, are they competitive against themselves, or are they competitive against other people? Right? 2 different things, both drivers, none worse or better, but I just need to understand what that is. From a work ethic standpoint, like, are they a structured process kind of person, or are they not? Right? So where do they get their discipline, and what kind of stamina? Are they somebody that like a push through, or do you start to lose them at 2 o'clock and they need a siesta kind of a thing? So those things stand out to me. They're, depending on the type of role it is, if it's a management or leadership role, there's a certain level of financial acumen that you would need to have for specific positions. And if it's a functional leadership role, then obviously, you need to know your trade if you're engineering or if you're marketing or something like that. So I would say those as second tier things, but at the top, it's got to start with that trust and that integrity. Like that's a big trigger. And there are a lot of assessments out there that you can use that help to really uncover that stuff if you can't see it on the front side, or if their body of work doesn't tell it, which if you do your due diligence, you can oftentimes find that. But I think that's the first thing. When I do a lot of speaking to college students, and then the onboarding that happens all over our country, I'll do some regular guest talks with the staff.
And just to plug you, you've done a TED Talk.
Yeah. TEDx. I've not been on the big TED stage, but yeah, thank you. So in speaking with them, one of the very first things I talk about is you have a personal brand, and everything you decide to do and don't decide to do shape that brand. And reputation is a part of that. And you could spend years doing the right thing over and over again, and all of a sudden make a shady decision, and it's really hard to escape that. And the image that I pull up on the screen is a footprint in concrete. And it takes a lot of, and I just said that's my analogy for, or metaphor, however you want to look at it, for reputation. And it's really hard to make that go away, whether it erodes on its own, or you got to get jackhammer and use force. I mean, you make a bad decision, it's hard to recover from that.
Nice, thanks, Scott. I think one thing that Steve and I were talking about a little bit this week is, in this season, Scott, as you think about leadership, what are some of the keys you think for the people who are going to lead well through this? What do you think are some of the things they're going to do that's going to separate them from people who aren't going to lead well through the season we're in right now?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. A couple things come to mind when you say that. I think first, back to my first thing, raising your hand if you have a problem. Naturally, this season we're in now created a lot of problems for a lot of people, right? But you have to recognize that amplification is happening. So if you're sitting in a leadership position, you've got to realize that the things you did really really well are probably amplified right now, and the things you did really poorly are probably amplified right now. So if I'm Amazon, the fact that I made shopping convenient from my couch thing, but now I made it safe from my couch. My became scenario, whereas maybe in other scenarios, the best the way you should have or trained your people against it. Now all of a sudden you hit this patch that we're in. Wow, that's really amplified if you haven't embraced technology. So just recognize as a leader, we're in like crisis mode, especially at this level, amplifies the good and the bad within an organization or your vendors or your partners or whoever you're working with across the way, which brings me to my second point when I said a couple things come to mind. Context. So you've got to recognize that everybody operating in this new normal that we're in right now is able to digest it or deal with it differently, right? Based on the situation that are in. If I'm in news talk, I'm absolutely loving this world right now because everybody's tuning into me, and it's an opportunity in broadcast to expand my brand and be a really good journalist and that type of deal. If I'm in morning drive entertainment, well, that's a little bit more of a struggle when, you know, the pajama effect hits. And right now people aren't leaving their houses and they're in their pajamas almost all day, right? And so they might not have that morning drive that they once had. So things are different. And when I say understand context, if you're dealing with people and you don't consider the context of their situation and try to paint it with a broad stroke, you're gonna miss it, right? You really got to have that empathy to understand their scenario. And there's something that I do for my highest leaders, and I do it when I first start working with them. And you've probably seen this before. If you haven't, please watch it. It's worth 3 minutes of your life. I think so. I'm a big root cause person. So if you ever did, you know, any kind of the personality assessments or that type of thing, like I score really well on root cause, which means, you know, I really just ask why and get to the core of it, because I think that's how you really solve things. And there's this great video that I play, and I can't remember the person who created it, but it's about the Jefferson Memorial. And the Jefferson Memorial in DC was crumbling, right? And they hired consultants to figure out why it was crumbling. And I might mess up the story a little bit, but directionally I'm going to have it right. So the consultants came in and said, well, it's so close to the air, or no, I think they first said no, it was acid rain. That's the problem. And they're like, well, no, it can't be just the acid rain, because I'm not seeing this effect everywhere else. And then they said, well, but it's the proximity to the airport. Right? So over the country, they weren't seeing it. And they're saying, well, no, it's the proximity to the airport. And they said, well, the other monuments aren't seeing this, because, you know, and so they said, well, they had a consultant come in and say, okay, so they start scrubbing the statue down because they think that it's the jet fuel mixed with the acid rain and everything that's creating the crumbling. And they said, well, why are you scrubbing it? So why are you watching the monument so much? They're like, well, because all the pigeon droppings. And they're like, well, they had a pigeon consultant come in. They're like, why are we getting all these pigeon droppings? Well, the pigeons are coming around the memorial to eat the spiders. And they're like, okay, well, why are they eating the spiders? Why are the spiders showing up? And I guess there's apparently these sand fleas that breed in the water that are in the pool. I forget what they're called, but there's some type of sand flea, and that's what the spiders eat. And they're like, well, why are there so many sand fleas there and not around any of the other monuments? Well, it's because they turn the floodlights on at dusk, and that bright light allows for the mating of these small things that the sand fleas that the spiders eat. So instead of moving the airport and trying to change the weather patterns and killing all the pigeons and all this kind of stuff, they shut down the floodlights at dusk. And all of a sudden, these sand fleas go away, which means the spiders go away, which means the pigeons don't have the droppings, which means they don't have to scrub the monument with the harsh chemicals, and the airport gets to stay where it is. And all of a sudden, by asking why 5 times and getting to the root cause, you really find a solution that lasts. And I play that for my managers because I want them to think like the first thing that you hear from your team, the first data you hear from the marketplace, you need to ask why. You need to go deeper on that to find out what the root cause is to make sure that you're solving the right problem. Because I don't think most people fail because they don't work hard at solving a problem. They fail because they're not solving the right problem. And to me, that gets to the root cause thinking. And I think that skill moving forward, regardless of what our new normal is and what pandemic or what data crisis or whatever comes and hits us moving forward, I think, you know, having the critical thinking skills and that root cause analysis is just going to be more and more important.
Scott, when you talk about amplification and, you know, your good being amplified and the weaknesses being amplified, right now may be a hard time to address some of those weaknesses, to make changes. You know, everybody's distant, you're not operating as you usually operate. What would you suggest to someone who's a leader in an organization? You recognize you have a weakness, but we're in a mode where you can't really, you know, fix that, you know, tomorrow. It's something that's a longer term fix and a trajectory. How do you engage those things to make them less liabilities from the things that you're doing well?
So are you saying that you as the leader recognize you have a weakness, or you recognize it in someone else?
Or I guess maybe because the situation now is amplifying that there is a weakness in your own organization. What can you do even in times where things aren't operating normally? There's not like an easy fix. You can't just shuffle one person out of here, you know, to fix that issue. How do you engage that in a way that builds trust and that can actually minimize the liability it may be to your organization in the meantime while you have a longer term solution?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It actually just happened to me this last week. I had a leader who raised their hand to me, which gets back to my first, you know, one of the first things that I said. They raised their hand to me and they're like, listen, this isn't my strong suit. And they actually came out and said, it was a certain systems thing, is not my strong suit. Will you help me? And this person, historically, and I started working with this person probably 2.5 years ago, never, even though I knew it, never admitted that that was a weak point of theirs, and either suffered in silence or had someone else do it, or it wasn't quite as amplified. But they did the first thing, which actually increased trust for me, because they said, all right, I recognize I'm not great at this, and they're asking me for help. I'm going to bend over backwards for that person, because that's a hard thing to do. Now, again, the caveat is there's all different leaders in all different forms and sizes and shapes. If you have a leader that you don't think will respond well to that and you say that to them, that's a tough situation that you're in. And that's if it's that situation and you can't go to your leader and raise your hand because you just don't have that kind of organization, I think finding who else colleague-wise that is the kind of ham to your egg, if you want to call it that, or the glove to your hand, like who is it that you can work with to offset, and maybe you could bring something to the party for them, so that ultimately at the end, if that person at the top only cares about the result at the end, that might be a good way to get by it.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, just being able to acknowledge those weaknesses, and even as organizations, I mean, there are things that, you know, we've seen as a church that, you know, you can, normally it didn't really matter, but now in this high pressure change of situation, some of those things come out. And to be able to say, hey, you know, we recognize this is a weaker spot, and we're going to work on this longer term, but thanks for your patience as we walk through that. And just, you know, trust building opportunities, even in the middle of a really hard thing to walk through, as a whole world. So Scott, it's been awesome. We've gone a while here, and I'm just curious, you know, as just a leader that I respect, that we, you know, have looked up to for a while, and you're in the middle of this too. Everything's different. It's changed. I'm just curious for you, like, what are you looking forward to right now, that when this is finally all done in the year 2032, that you're going, I just can't wait for this to just lift, because I want to do this because it's really life-giving. I'm curious what that is for you.
So two things jump into my mind for that. One is family oriented, which is, as a family, my wife and I, we love watching the kids play sports, you know, particularly soccer. And then my daughter plays a little bit of basketball, and getting back out to where we were there and just enjoying that time and watching that and just taking it in, you realize how much you miss it when you don't have it, right? Isn't that the old saying? And that's one thing. And the other thing, and this is more the selfish side, so putting my family aside, I miss getting together for breakfast and coffee with people. I've definitely adhered to the social distancing. From March 11th, I've been in my house. You know, I don't know what businesses are open and closed because I don't even try to go in them. So like being able to sit down at the diner or sit down with and just have those meaningful, and we're doing face-to-face now, but like breaking bread and having meal with somebody, I'm excited to do that.
Have you enjoyed even a little bit not running into the city all the time?
100%, 100%. Here's the deal with that though. Not having that commute in and out of the city or commute across the country or what have you, my company has gotten so much more productivity out of me, because like I get up and roll out of bed at 6 or after a workout or something, and I'll start working. Then all of a sudden it's 7 or 8 o'clock. Normally I'd have downtime in the car. I listen to sermons in the car in the morning. That's what I do. So like I had to find new time to do that. And the company's just getting more hours out of me. So yeah, I got to find that
Don't
balance.
tell them that, Scott.
No, but here's the other half of it though. I get to have, breakfast and a cup of coffee with my wife. When my kids and my lunch line up, I get to have that. We have dinners every night together. So the silver lining on that is the deeper connection with the family is great, even if the hours are different for work. So I'm certainly not complaining about it, but to your point, I do not miss that commute in and out of the city. We took I'll end with we took a Sunday drive 2 Sundays ago. It was 2 Sundays ago now. I think it was, because it was beautiful outside. And we drove for maybe 30 minutes, and I'm like, I'm done. I don't have to drive for another, I don't care how many months. I've got the driving out of my system.
Absolutely, man. Well, I mean, I could stay here for another 3 hours chatting and hearing from, just, I mean, what you share is always really, really good. Grateful for your experience, and also really grateful for just your love for the church and your investment in pouring into us and others, and the way you get to do that, and how you've ingrained yourself in the community at the Glen Rock campus, and those around you. It really it does matter, and really grateful for it, Scott.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, thank you for that. And I want to just say this, and I think Ryan wants to say something next, and we could let him close or whatever, but I want to say, I personally, and I know my family because we talk about it, I'm grateful to you two and your entire team for how you've all embraced technology and change and really managed to develop companionship and continued relationship, even though we're isolated in our homes, through what we're doing today, but also through the services, the music. I watched it evolve from day one, and the changes that you've made, because I kind of get into production, into music a little bit, and just everything feels so good, and that's a credit to you, your team. I couldn't thank all of them, and plus I don't know all of them, but it takes a lot of people to pull off what you did, because we do a lot of that. We do living room concerts on television with artists. It takes a lot to do that well, and you guys continue to do it well, and I'm thankful. You guys are blessed, and I'm blessed, and my family's blessed to have you all doing it.
Well, iHeart probably has more people doing it than Emergent.
I was about to say, if you really want to, you can just have the iHeart team take over like a few weeks.
Which is even more impressive, that you have fewer people and you're still able to produce that kind of quality. I mean, it's outstanding. It is a production. I look forward. I actually get even scared to a certain degree that it is so good, sitting with my cup of coffee and sermon, and then talking with the family immediately after, when the comfort of our home. I want to be back with, because we're called to be together. But it's also so nice how well you've produced it. So
there's going to be
seems amazing.
There's going to be a real interesting season, Scott, where we're asking the question: at what point because with social distancing, no kids, man, all that stuff, it's not going to be the greatest experience. At what point do we really open? When does the virtual experience get worse than the live experience?
Mhm.
And I don't know the answer to that.
When the reality is that for a good long while, we're going to have, 90%, then 80%, then, 70% of people that are still only experiencing online. It's made us go, how do we make sure we're investing correctly, in these things? So it's an interesting thing.
And you talked about the Amazon thing. One of the things that was a benefit for us, because we don't pass a plate, when this all happened, our church gave online anyway.
Yeah.
And man, our congregation has been really generous in this season, and it just was really awesome to see that happen. But anyway, Scott, I just wanted to say, to a lot of people at our church who don't get to see you, just the way you've shaped Steve and I over the years and coached us and given us insight. Thank you for that. Really do appreciate you guys and your family, and grateful for you doing this.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I'm humbled by those words, watching what you all do, thinking that I helped in any small way. That's humbling, and I'm very grateful for those words. So thank you.
Cool.
Thanks, Scott. And hey, thanks for all of you tuning in again. Hopefully it was really beneficial. That's why we do this, and it does keep a sense of normalcy, for all of us. But beyond that, these are things that God can use, and we hope he has today, and will continue to, because otherwise there's really no purpose in it. But with him, there's great purpose. So have a great end of your week. And we've got services coming up on the weekend. We got Saturday Pray tomorrow in the morning at 10, services at 9, 10:15, 11:45, and 6:30 p.m. And you can tune into those. And thanks again, Scott. Ryan, thank you. And we'll talk to you soon.